Hello everyone and welcome back to another album review. In this video I'm going to review It's Almost Dry by Pusha T. This is the brand new album of who I would consider to be one of my favorite rappers I've stumbled upon. Pusha T has a pretty good and consistent catalog as a rapper, and I was particularly impressed with his previous album Daytona, which for me has already managed to be one of the most exceptional rap albums that I've ever heard. I think that for one we got Kanye West on his peak in terms of production, but also Pusha T's cold-blooded and awesome delivery really elevated on making this album much more special, so even if we're talking about a pretty short album, it's still one of the best things that I've heard, especially in terms of a more recent hip-hop album. So I was obviously getting into It's Almost Dry with high expectations. I was not necessarily expecting for this album to reach the glories of Daytona, but I was still pretty satisfied with what I've heard out of the main singles of this album. The track Diet Coke instantly had a very positive impression on me. Interestingly enough, it goes into a much more old school sound, as it reminds me much more of like a 90s era of hip-hop, which I believe it's done really nicely. Considering the overall style and delivery of Pusha T, it really fits on this song. I believe that the instrumental by itself is really solid, it works for it being as minimal as it is, and I like some of the extra additions of Kanye West in terms of the production, like with those parts where you have the crack samples that really give the feel of some of the experimentations that we saw on Daytona. The consistency kept on going with the next single, Hear Me Clearly, another pretty minimal and straightforward song that in my opinion just works pretty nicely for what it is, and one that in comparison with Diet Coke sounds slightly more aggressive and a bit more haunting, also managing to fit the more cold-blooded nature of Pusha T's delivery. So another track that in my opinion just works really fine as what it is, with the bass response, with the overall sound and production having this old school feel to it. It feels like another really well crafted song. And finally there was the single Neck and Wrist featuring Jay-Z and Pharrell Williams, which I believe it's an interesting track, definitely one of the best the album has to offer. However, in terms of the teaser tracks, it's possibly my least favorite, even though it feels like the most developed song. Some of the approaches with the deliveries and the vocals were not necessarily my favorites, but again in terms of production and beats we get some pretty cool results. In terms of the rest of the album, what really helps with this one is that we get a much longer experience in comparison to Daytona, but still it's not an album that overstays its welcome. Instead, when it comes to hip-hop albums, this is another short one. It goes only for 35 minutes long, and I think that it's really fitting because we don't really get that many fillers out of this album, which I believe there are a few moments that don't hold up as strong in comparison to others, but even if this doesn't have Daytona's impact, it's still one of the best experiences in regards to a more modern hip-hop album. I believe that Pusha T delivers once again with this one, making what's arguably one of the greatest rap and hip-hop albums of 2022. It shares many of the elements that I appreciate with Daytona, and I think that in this one we get a pretty nice balance of modern hip-hop sounds and more old school ones tied together in an album that somewhat feels refreshing, but also just keeping a more old school identity, which just both of those worlds in my opinion just collide really nicely together. Like the very first track, Brambleton, is a very good example of that in my opinion. It mostly feels like a cool old school hip hop song, but the addition of this really awesome bass just gives it a more modern approach, which in my opinion works amazingly, and it makes for a pretty nice combination of sounds. Especially when it comes to the more aggressive bass over here, I think that it works perfectly. It's also something that I'd say is another good example with the track Let the Smokers and the Coupes. Extremely good use of samples, an anthemic and pumped up song with a very nice bass response overall. The track Dreaming of the Past featuring Ye is a track that gives very strong Ye vibes. It reminds me a bit of like Bound 2, with also some of the approaches with the sampling that we saw with Daytona, but it's a track that I'm slightly indifferent towards it because I believe that it needed a bit more than just having the sample portion. In my opinion, if there was the inclusion of like a bass portion or like an additional beat, this would make it in my opinion a bit of a better experience. Also when it comes to Ye, his portion is not really that good. The vocals sound pretty rough. It is a bit of an effect that we got with Don Tattoo as well, and in my opinion they don't really sound that good. So yeah, Ye's part is not really that much great in this particular track, so it ended up not being one of my favorite moments. Just So You Remember is a pretty interesting song out of this album. It is a bit of a more laid back moment. Out of this instrumental I got elements from like the minimal percussions out of the track Sociopath, and with the sampling techniques it reminded me a bit of Comeback Baby, so I believe that it's a nice combination of sounds and it fits nicely with this overall album, and I believe that it's one of the most interesting songs over here. The track Rock and Roll features Ye and Kid Cudi, and I believe that it's a kinda awkward moment in this album, as Kid Cudi himself is at this point not in good terms with Ye. He is only in this song just because he's fine with Pusha T, so this makes it kind of a weird situation for those three artists being together, but still it's another song that suffers from the fact that Ye has a verse that is mixed pretty rough over here, and I believe that it's kind of a busy song. I like the instrumental, but with the inclusion of this chipmunk soul sample that is put to it, I believe that it's a bit of a distraction with the vocals and the rapping come into place, so it's a track that in my opinion feels fine as an instrumental, but not one where the rapping and the vocals feel all that much fitting. In Call by Bluff we get a bit of a different delivery from Pusha T, which is not really one of my favorites, but in terms of the instrumental I believe that it's a very nice combination of like some more smooth sounds but with a really aggressive and hard-hitting bass. So this makes it a quite interesting instrumental, but in my opinion it's not the best one in terms of its deliveries. Scrape It Off is without a doubt my least favorite moment over here. This is a track that features Lil Uzi Vert and Toliver, and it really feels like it breaks the flow of this whole album. This one doesn't really feel like it belongs over here. It is the one track that in my opinion has the most forgettable deliveries and the most forgettable instrumental. In all fronts, this track doesn't really impress me in any way. I believe that it's the one song that didn't really have that much of a place in this track listing. Open Air is a pretty short moment over here. It is a pretty cool song, but feels slightly like a filler, as it doesn't really develop into something all that much, and in my opinion the album already had some more interesting instrumentals beforehand. Finally we have the track I Pray For You featuring Labyrinth and Malice, which I believe it's a pretty interesting finisher. It ended up not being one of my favorite moments, but I really like what this track did with the instrumental, as it had this really old school feel to it, with some nice sections with the church organs. I believe that it's a pretty interesting song. It definitely gives a nice impression as one of the more different moments over here, and even if it's not one of my favorite moments, it's definitely a pretty interesting way to end the album. So for the most part I believe that this is another excellent body of work from Pusha T, another one of those albums that shows that Pusha T is one of the best rappers out there. Some really cool deliveries, some really cool instrumentals, and just another hip hop album out of him that sounds really solid, that I do recommend it. I'm gonna give it almost try an 8- out of 10. What's your opinion on this album? Like it, dislike it, why, and what do you want to review next time? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.